Baby Bear recognizes the man who saved him. What happens next is unbelievable. The sweltering August sun bore down over Montana's Flathead National Forest like a furnace, casting waves of heat through the parched canopy and turning the once vibrant greens of the landscape into brittle shades of ochre and brown. Wildlife Ranger Mike Harrington maneuvered his dusty patrol truck along a narrow fire road, the wheels crunching over loose gravel as he scanned the tree-line with practiced eyes. At 42, Mike was as much a part of this forest as the towering ponderosa pines that had watched him grow from rookie to seasoned guardian. Over 2 decades, he had seen firestorms sweep through valleys and floods carve new paths into the earth, but this year's drought had been different, merciless, slow, and suffocating, draining the life from everything it touched. Streams that once babbled with trout now lay dry, their beds cracked like old skin. Meadows that teemed with elk were silent, brittle, and ghost-like. Even the wind seemed reluctant to blow, as though conserving energy in this exhausted wilderness. Crossing a sun-baked ravine, Mike slowed his truck and bumped to a halt as something caught his eye, a shape, slumped and motionless beside what used to be a creek. He climbed out cautiously, boots crunching over stones, his instincts alert. A grizzly. Her body splayed unnaturally against the dust, her coat dulled and crusted with dirt. Beside her, barely visible against her massive bulk, was a cub. It was moving, barely. Its tiny form pressing repeatedly against the mother's ribs, as if trying to wake her. Mike's breath hitched. He knew the protocol: observe, report, do not interfere. But then came the sound, a soft, ragged whimper that cut through the stillness like a splinter. It wasn't just noise. It was heartbreak, a sound filled with panic, confusion, and an aching need for comfort. He hesitated only a moment longer before descending the ravine. The cub noticed him immediately, tensing and baring baby teeth with a low growl, more pitiful than threatening. Its golden-brown fur was dull with dust and tangled with burrs. Eyes defiant yet sunken, Mike crouched low, his voice gentle as a breeze. "Easy, little one. I'm not here to hurt you." He stayed there, still speaking softly, not moving beyond the shift of his weight. The cub snarled again, then whimpered before collapsing beside its mother, as if the effort of resistance was too great. It was minutes before it lifted its head again, panting, watching Mike inch forward. Arms extended but open-palmed, he whispered anything that came to mind: songs, memories, apologies. Slowly, achingly, the cub inched toward him. When it finally let its head rest against his outstretched hand, he swallowed the lump in his throat and moved to gather it into his arms. It was feather-like, limp, the kind of weight that spoke of danger. Mike wrapped it in his flannel overshirt and turned back to the truck. The drive to the Flathead Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was a blur of desperate speed. He called ahead, alerting them to prepare. By the time he arrived, Dr. Jessica Monroe was already at the door, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp behind her glasses. Mike barely made it through the threshold before Jessica took the cub from his arms. Severe dehydration, blood sugars crashing. "He's on the edge," she murmured, already placing an 4. "We'll start fluids and bring him under the heat lamp. We need to get his body temperature back up." Mike stood there, useless, his heart thumping as the cub was whisked into a treatment room. He didn't leave. He paced the hallway like an anxious parent. His ranger's badge heavy in his pocket, he knew there would be consequences, knew the rules, the paperwork, the hearings. He'd broken federal wildlife protocol. But when he thought about the cub's cries, he'd do it all again. Hours later, the door opened. Jessica stepped out, her features softened. He's stable, still weak, but out of immediate danger. Mike, you might have saved him with just minutes to spare. She gave him a faint smile. Want to see him in the recovery room? The cub lay curled on a blanket under a warm glow, a tiny tangle of limbs and fur. Jessica handed Mike a bottle fitted with a rubber nipple. You're on feeding duty. Mike chuckled, surprised by the lump in his throat. What's his name? She looked down at the cub's golden-brown coat, which shimmered like a sunset under the lamp. We're calling him Sundown. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm foreign to Mike's ranger life, bottle feedings every few hours, swaddling the cub in warm blankets, whispering to him through the long, quiet nights. Mike slept on a cot in the corner of the hallway, never far. He noted everything, Sundown's appetite returning, the brightness creeping back into his eyes, how his tiny claws scratched at the air during dreams. On the 4th day, Mike received the call he knew was coming. His superior at the Bureau of Land Management was turning him in for disobeying a direct wildlife intervention protocol. Your actions, though well-intentioned, undermined field integrity. 2 weeks suspension without pay. Mike thanked them, no argument. He hung up and went back to Sundown's room, where the cub was trying to gnaw on the blanket. Worth it, he whispered. When Sundown was strong enough, he was moved to the Flathead Bear Sanctuary, where experts would begin the delicate process of preparing him for eventual release. Mike helped load the crate, resting a hand gently on the cub's head before the door closed. Sundown licked his fingers once, then turned, settling quietly inside. As the van pulled away, Mike watched until it vanished around the bend. He would have stayed longer, but he had to step back for the cub's sake. Still, as he returned to his solitary cabin nestled on the forest edge, the silence felt different now, emptier. As he sat on his porch that evening, drink in hand, his thoughts wandered to the cub's defiant eyes, the streak of white across his brow that caught the sun like frost. Somewhere deep inside, he had the sense that their story wasn't over, that fate had only just opened the first page. The Flathead Bear Sanctuary stretched across hundreds of acres of rugged Montana wilderness, a landscape of pines and open meadows stitched together with winding creeks and hidden dens. Here, animals found not cages, but purpose, not captivity, but healing. Sundown, the golden-brown cub with the distinctive white facial blaze, arrived in a quiet hum of wheels on gravel and cautious hope. His crate opened to the scent of pine needles and the distant trill of chickadees. At first, Sundown stayed pressed to the back wall, his small body wary and still. But the air carried the language of the wild, and he remembered it. His nose twitched, his ears turned slowly. Sundown stepped into his new world. Waiting near the fence line was Abby Carson, 21 years old and already deep in her doctoral work studying bear behavior. With her hair tucked into a ponytail and her boots caked with mud, she crouched silently, notebook in hand. Her job was observation, not interference. But even from those first tentative steps, she noticed something different about this cub. While most rescues retreated for days or weeks before engaging, Sundown watched her with open curiosity. He didn't approach, not yet, but he didn't hide either. His gaze was steady, even bold. Abby made a note of it, circling her words twice: unusual social behavior. Possible early human bonding. Over the weeks, Sundown acclimated. He began eating solid food, digging up grubs clumsily, and chasing insects across sun-warmed rocks. He splashed through shallow streams with the awkward joy only a young animal could embody. He grew stronger, his coat regaining its sunlit sheen. The white streak on his face was now a striking signature. But he remained attentive. He would pause mid-play to watch Abby as she sketched in her notebook, ears pricked whenever she read aloud the behavioral logs to herself. Most of the time, she forgot she was being studied too. He made her smile often. Once, during a quiet moment, she murmured, "You miss him, don't you?" Sundown didn't respond, of course, but he sat down before her, curling his paw under him as if to stay a while. She jotted another note, possible memory retention of human bond. Strong imprint. Elsewhere, Mike Harrington spent his suspension restoring trails near Glacier National Park and trying not to think about the silence that followed Sundown's departure. He told himself it was the right thing, that the cub needed distance now to reconnect with its wild self. But every time he passed a stream bed, he imagined the cub drinking. Every time he heard a rustle in the brush, he wondered if Sundown would have chased it. Back at work, weeks later, Mike kept tabs on the sanctuary's quarterly reports and even donated anonymously to their new enclosure project. But he never visited, not until 5 years later, when life turned back toward the unexpected. By then, Mike had transitioned to the Bureau of Land Management's outreach coordinator role, a position that put him back among people more than animals. He missed the field but found purpose in education, in making sure others cared enough to protect what he loved. It was in this capacity that he joined AB's new research team, now fully funded and focused on long-term bear reintroduction outcomes. The project brought him back to Flathead, to the same mountains and winding trails, this time armed with telemetry equipment and a clipboard. They were tracking collars, now reliable GPS units used to chart migration patterns, diet shifts, denning behaviors. Sundown was one of their subjects, though not by name in the files. He was Bear 912G, a male grizzly of remarkable size and stable health, reintroduced near Mount Ishbel. Abby briefed the team on his history, omitting details she instinctively knew Mike wouldn't want publicly tied back to him, but her voice softened when she mentioned the cub's rapid early recovery and unusual social cognition. Mike asked no questions, but his gaze lingered on the photograph, a still frame from a trail camera showing a broad-shouldered bear drinking from a creek. The distinctive white blaze was clear even in the grainy pixels. Late one afternoon, the team hiked into a remote basin to place new trail cameras and check scent marking stations. Abby was explaining claw-like markings when a rustle snapped their attention to the tree line. A bear stood there, half-shadowed by a line of quaking aspen, not just any bear, Sundown. Older, bigger, a powerful presence carved by years of survival. His fur gleamed with healthy oils, and his stance was alert but calm. Mike stepped forward without thinking, a soft gasp escaping him. "Sundown," he whispered. The name broke across the space between them like a memory spoken aloud. The bear's ears lifted, his body stilled, and then, impossibly, Sundown stepped forward. The researchers froze, whispering, fumbling for cameras. Abby raised her binoculars, breath held. Sundown ambled forward, not with aggression or confusion, but with a familiarity that defied explanation. He reached Mike, nose twitching, and then gently nudged Mike's hand with his broad head, the same motion he used to make in the rehab center when hungry, when seeking warmth. Mike's hand trembled as he reached to stroke the thick fur behind Sundown's ear. "You remember," he breathed. After all this time, Sundown let out a low, steady rumble, not warning but greeting, a vibration of recognition. Abby, stunned, captured the moment on video. Within hours, the footage traveled across the globe. Social media dubbed it the Sundown Encounter. Scientists debated the implications for scene memory and interspecies recognition. Conservationists heralded it as proof of deeper emotional and cognitive lives in animals. Dr. Eleanor Winters, a leading animal cognition researcher, called it a watershed moment in understanding the mammalian memory arc. Donations flooded the Flathead Bear Sanctuary. Funding soared by 300%, and suddenly, the quiet bond between one man and one cub became a symbol of something far greater. Weeks later, Mike stood again at the sanctuary's gate, this time as a guest. Sundown, still collared and semi-wild, was living in a transition zone, a space for adult bears nearing full release but still monitored. When Mike entered the zone's observation deck, Sundown appeared at the tree-line within minutes. He didn't approach right away, but his ears flicked, and he let out a soft huff, a greeting. Abby joined Mike on the deck with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Her eyes were warm. "He never does that for anyone else," she said. "You left a deeper imprint than even we understood." They sat in silence for a while, watching the bear wander, dig, sniff, and finally sit under a tree. Abby spoke again, slower this time. "I've been thinking, what if we created something lasting from this, something bigger than just a research moment?" Mike turned to her, curious. "Like what?" She smiled. "A foundation for cognition research, sanctuary expansion, community education. We could call it the Sundown Foundation." Mike sipped his coffee and looked back at the bear resting under the pine shade. He nodded slowly. "Let's do it." 6 months later, the Sundown Foundation launched, with support from universities, nonprofits, and nature preserves. Its mission was to explore the emotional memory of wildlife, support sanctuaries for aging and injured bears, and create education programs to inspire the next generation of conservationists. Abby led research efforts that uncovered complex behaviors in grizzlies previously dismissed as coincidence. Mike visited schools, telling Sundown's story to wide-eyed children, passing around photos, and urging them to see wildlife not as threats or curiosities but as fellow passengers on the earth. The bear in the photo, once a whimpering cub cradled against a ranger's chest, had become more than a memory. He was a living bridge between species, between instinct and compassion, between survival and kinship. Even as Sundown grew more wild with each season, more distant, the thread between him and Mike never snapped, not fully. It simply stretched like a tether of sunlight over a long open valley, unseen but never unfelt. A story still unfolding beneath the sky, ready for Chapter 3. When the video of Sundown's approach to Mike spread like fire in dry grass, it was more than viral. It was a cultural spark. News anchors choked up retelling the story. Conservation blogs dubbed it the bear who remembered, and within a week, national wildlife agencies were fielding interviews about cognition and bears, creatures long viewed as solitary and instinct-driven. The footage, raw and quietly powerful, showed Sundown emerging from the trees like a memory made flesh. The camera trembled as he paused, head lifting, body still, except for a single breath. Mike's voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with disbelief. "Sundown." Then, with the grace of something ancient and sacred, the bear approached, not lumbering, not aggressive. A deliberate walk, a gesture of familiarity, of home. He nudged Mike's hand, like an echo from 5 years past, and the world stopped. Scientists had theories. Some spoke of olfactory imprinting. Others hypothesized that long-term associative memory might exist in species previously thought too instinct-bound for such nuance. But for Mike, none of that mattered. He knew it wasn't just a smell or a flicker of recognition. It was a bond formed in heat, hunger, and gentleness, in need. The kind of connection you don't forget, even across time and wilderness. In the following days, experts like Dr. Eleanor Winters, a cognitive ethologist at the University of Washington, weighed in with cautious awe. We have documented elephant mourning, chimpanzee sign language, even orca dialects, she said during one broadcast. But this is a new frontier. If Sundown truly remembered Mike after all this time, it challenges everything we assumed about grizzly bear cognition. The attention brought unexpected consequences. Donations to the Flathead Bear Sanctuary surged by 300%. Volunteers doubled. Schools across the state requested guest speakers from the project. One morning, Abby found herself fielding calls from a documentary crew and a children's book publisher in the same hour. And through it all, Sundown remained at the center, a golden-brown beacon of what could happen when compassion met wilderness with respect and care. Mike visited the sanctuary 2 weeks later. Sundown was still semi-wild, living within the vast perimeter that mimicked his natural habitat, but the staff had noticed his patterns. He came to the edge more often when Mike arrived, not like a pet, not dependent, but present, curious. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and turned the fields to molten amber, Mike stood by the observation blind. Sundown ambled toward the fence, his white facial blaze catching the light. He paused, then lowered his head through the open partition between the protected zone and the inner barrier. Mike crouched. "Hey there, old friend," he said softly. Sundown let out a low chuff, and for a few minutes there was no sound but the wind moving through the grass, the rhythm of their shared breath. That evening, over coffee in the research trailer, Mike and Abby talked until the stars burned silver above the mountains. They spoke not just of Sundown, but of the future, of what his story had stirred in people, of what it could become. "There's more here than just emotion," Abby said, her eyes alive with thought. "There's science, storytelling, education. If this connection challenges what we think we know, we owe it to Sundown and every bear out there to follow that trail." Mike nodded, his hands wrapped around the enamel mug. "We could build something," he said slowly. "Not just a sanctuary, a foundation for research, for outreach, for kids who've never even seen a wild animal but still care." And that night, with stars spilling over the trees like seeds, the Sundown Foundation was born, not yet in ink but in resolve. 6 months later, it had a name, a mission, and a team. The Sundown Foundation launched with grants from 2 universities, crowdfunding from over 40,000 individual donors, and a matching contribution from a philanthropist who had once wept watching the Sundown video on her flight from Zurich. Its goals were ambitious: fund advanced research into animal memory and cognition, improve sanctuary infrastructure for long-term rehabilitation, and develop immersive educational programs for rural and urban schools alike. Abby oversaw the science. Mike, with his background in outreach and public policy, took charge of community partnerships. They built a mobile exhibit, an interactive truck called the Wild Mine, that brought touchscreen displays, VR bear habitats, and real-time GPS bear tracking data to schools and libraries. In classrooms, children traced Sundown's story across wall-sized maps, watching his migration paths and learning how bears adapted to climate change, forest loss, and human encroachment. In one classroom, a boy named Daniel raised his hand after the video presentation and asked, "Do you think he misses Mike when he's far away?" Mike, standing at the back, blinked away, something in his eye. "Maybe," he said. "But I think he carries part of me with him, just like I carry him." Meanwhile, the sanctuary expanded. Older bears, once deemed unfit for release, found new purpose in the elder enclosure, designed with comfort, stimulation, and dignity. Abby led research on their social structures, compiling a study that would later be published in Nature Wildlife Quarterly, titled Echoes in the Pines: Memory Retention and Social Bonds in Rescued Grizzlies. For Sundown, the wild always called. He spent more and more time in the outer range, roaming higher, farther, returning only intermittently. He had changed, grown. His body was now massive, his stride full of confidence, but he remained gentle in his encounters with the sanctuary team. One spring, he was spotted leading 2 younger bears toward a prime foraging ridge, behavior rarely seen outside maternal patterns. Abby noted it with awe. He's mentoring. That's not instinct, that's memory turned to guidance. 5 years passed since that day in the woods when Sundown had stepped out of legend and into recognition. Mike, now in his late 40s, had grown silver at the temples. Abby, no longer the quiet field researcher, was a keynote speaker at global conservation forums, and Sundown, now 10, had begun to linger at the edge of the sanctuary, watching the ridge lines beyond. He paced more, vocalized occasionally. The signs were clear: he was ready, not just for space, but for freedom. The sanctuary had given him safety, but the wild still lived in his bones. And so, one mist-streaked morning, Mike and Abby walked with him to the boundary gate. He was collarless, microchipped, yes, but otherwise unmarked. A free bear. A wild bear. They opened the gate, and Sundown stood still. He looked back once, eyes locking on Mike, then Abby, then forward again. He stepped into the wilderness with purpose, his body moving like it remembered every tree, every river, every wind-worn path ahead. A distant group of bears stirred. Sundown paused, then trotted toward them, joining their rhythm like he had always belonged. Mike wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his flannel. Abby stood beside him, silent. "He's home," Mike said, his voice breaking but proud. "And he's carrying a piece of us with him." Abby nodded, whispering, "And we carry him, too." Behind them, the gate stood open, wind rustling the tall grass. Sundown's story wasn't over, but it was his now, entirely. The sun rose slowly over the expanse of Flathead National Forest, bathing the mountain ridges in gold and amber as mist curled through the pines like breath. The mornings had grown quieter in the sanctuary, though not emptier. Something had shifted in the air since Sundown's release, not a hole, but an echo, a lingering warmth where presence used to be. Mike Harrington still walked the outer trails each week, boots crunching through soft pine needles and gravel, eyes scanning the forest as though Sundown might appear again, just for a moment, out of the brush. He never did, but Mike had stopped expecting him. Instead, he came to listen, to feel, to remember. Sometimes, the breeze would move through the trees just right, and Mike would swear he heard that low chuff, the one Sundown gave when recognizing a friend. It wasn't loss, it was something deeper, a knowing, a quiet, enduring tether. Back at the sanctuary's headquarters, things had blossomed in Sundown's wake. The Sundown Foundation had grown into a national network. Grants now supported sanctuaries in Oregon, Colorado, and Alberta. Their curriculum on wildlife empathy and cognition had been adopted in over 200 schools, sparking a generation of students to think not just about animals, but with them. Abby Carson, now 30, wore her leadership as naturally as her field jacket. She still walked the enclosures, still tracked wild collars, but more and more, she spoke to rooms full of policymakers and young scientists, her voice carrying stories that began with a cub in crisis and ended with a bear in flight. And yet, despite all the accolades and progress, Sundown remained more than a success story. He had become myth, real and rooted but carried like a fable. Children wrote letters to him. Artists painted murals of his golden fur and white blaze. Park rangers named trails after him. But to Mike and Abby, he was still just Sundown, the bear who chose to trust. 5 years passed, seasons churned with familiar rhythm, snowstorms and spring melt, berry bloom and rut. Cameras caught glimpses of Sundown every few months, paw prints in the snow, fur against a tree trunk, a silhouette against a sunset ridge. He was thriving. His range had expanded far beyond the sanctuary's bounds, pushing north into glaciers' remote corridors and east into tribal lands where ancient stories told of spirit bears, guides between earth and sky. Once, Abby received a blurry trail cam image from a Blackfeet conservation group. "We think this might be your bear," the message read. He was bigger now, his face broader, the white patch unmistakable even in shadow. He moved with purpose, alone, but not isolated. Abby printed the photo and tacked it on the office wall beside the original, a cub curled in a blanket, eyes half-lidded, mouth stained with formula. From then on, every update was a gift, proof not just of Sundown's survival, but his sovereignty, his choice. Still, Mike couldn't shake a feeling that something more was coming, a shift, not danger, not closure, just a turning point. And he was right. It happened in early spring. The mountains were still kissed with snow, but the thaw had begun. Streams rushed with melted ice, the air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Mike was at the sanctuary, helping coordinate a reforestation program, when a call came through. A wildlife researcher from a neighboring range had spotted a lone grizzly behaving unusually, watching campsites from a distance, leaving no signs of aggression but remaining nearby for days at a time, curious, calm, always just on the edge of vision. The descriptions made Mike's skin prickle. A golden coat, a white blaze like moonlight. Abby confirmed it with a team check-in. The colorless bear matched Sundown's markers. But more intriguing was his behavior. He wasn't looking for food. He wasn't asserting territory. He was waiting. So Mike went, not to reclaim, not to interfere, but to witness. The site was remote, nestled in a high glade between ridges, dotted with fresh bear tracks and a few flattened spots where something large had bedded down. Mike arrived alone, carrying only a light pack and a folding chair. He sat as the sky shifted from blue to rust, and then, just as the first stars bloomed, Sundown appeared. He moved out from the tree line with deliberate calm, his massive form backlit by dusk. Mike didn't stand, didn't speak. He simply opened his hands. Sundown stopped several feet away, studying him. The bear was magnificent, 10 years old now, fur thick with winter weight, eyes deep with a world Mike would never know. For a long time, they simply watched each other. Then Sundown rumbled low in his chest and stepped forward, not close, just enough. He turned his head westward toward the peaks beyond, then back at Mike. The message was clear, a kind of invitation, not to follow, but to understand. Mike felt it settle in his chest like a sunrise. Sundown had returned to say goodbye, not because he was leaving, but because he wanted to close the circle. And so Mike stood, nodded once, and whispered, "Thank you." Sundown moved off slowly, disappearing into the trees like mist into morning. Mike stayed for hours, watching the stars shift and scatter across the sky. When he returned to the sanctuary, he found Abby on the porch, eyes already searching the trail behind him. He shook his head. "He's gone." But it was right. Abby didn't ask questions. She just sat beside him, their silence full of something vast and reverent. Over the next months, sundown was not seen again, not by cameras, not by rangers, not by tribal monitors. It was as though the forest had folded around him, offering the privacy of legend. But his legacy didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. The foundation launched a wilderness exchange program, pairing high school students with rangers and biologists for real-time conservation work. The Sundown Scholarship began funding underrepresented youth pursuing wildlife science. Abby's cognitive research was cited in international environmental policy discussions. Mike, now semi-retired, wrote a book, Sundown, Memory of the Wild, blending narrative, science, and spirit. It became a quiet bestseller. In the final chapter, he wrote, "I once cradled a cub in my arms and thought I was saving his life. What I didn't realize was how much he would give me in return, a second calling, a reason to believe in gentler things." The forest has many voices. If you listen with your heart, one of them will sound like home. Years later, on the edge of the forest where it all began, a stone marker stands beside a trail, no fences, no signs. Just one inscription carved into the rock face facing west. For Sundown, who remembered, who returned, who was never truly gone. And beneath it, in smaller print, "Some bonds are not broken by time, nor distance, nor silence. They are written into the land, the trees, the stars, and into the heart."